观众朋友们好，欢迎大家来到本期的思想先驱报节目现场。近期在谈到中国经济的时候啊，我们可能会发现这样叫做冰火势不两容的两种论调啊。如果你是与一些这个西方的专家来聊，或者呢是与一些接受西方训练的经济学者来聊，可能他们会对于北京现在的政策取向非常的惊讶。比如按照西方的经济理论，在现在出现经济下行的时候，北京呢可能会利用两会的时机通过货币宽松消费刺激或者是对于房地产进行大幅救市这样的方式，来对于中国的经济进行某一种提振。但是如果你要是与中国的经济学者聊，或者是中国的政策学者聊，他们往往对于这样的救助方式不以为然。相反包括中国领导层内的一些经济官僚，往往把注意力集中在通过新技术让中国工业进行转型上。特别是现在在美国技术封锁的背景下，他们最强调的一个词叫做关键技术自给自足，当然其中最具代表性的就是半导体。那最近我们也看到中国向之前的半导体产业基金是增加了270亿美元的投入。同时今年的预算来看，国家科技方面的预算是大幅增加了10%。那么为什么会出现对于中国经济到底应该怎样走这样水火势不两容的看法呢？我们首先来看西方这一边的观点战略与国际研究中心的中国经济专家甘斯迪在之前的2月就曾经发布这样一份中国经济报告。他看到中国经济现在有多个薄弱点，实际的增长似乎比官方的数据还要低。另外我们看到已经出现了通货紧缩的现象，整个房地产市场还没有企稳，而股市的状况也十分不明朗。但是北京方面对于西方的这一种宏观经济学往往没有多大的兴趣。这样的一种学说更多的是处理于叫做管理需求，或者叫做提振需求、平稳需求这样的一个模式。而北京的经济学者更加关注于的是产业政策以及供给面的相关的支持。而两会之后，我们看到重要的数据似乎支持了北京对于中国经济状况不需要近期提振需求这样的看法。之前大家担心可能会出现通货紧缩，因此需要对于消费者的这样的一个消费需求进行大幅的提振。而如果我们看到核心 CPI 价格指数在2月份的时候已经是同比上涨了1.2%。所谓的核心 CPI 呢是去掉了食品价格。那之前我们也看到整个食品价格呢是对于整个 CPI 有比较大的这样的一个拖累那么这主要是由于过去的一年那么猪肉的价格受到猪瘟以及疫情的影响呢，是出现了比较偏离正轨的上涨。换句话说，北京方面认为短期内进行需求刺激其实并没有这么急迫。根据来自亚洲时报的有关报道现在我们看到中国的领导层更关注到的是以人民币计算的出口额，这样的一个数字在过去的1月到2月期间呢，是同比增长高达10%。这个数字在中国领导层看来仍然是相当可喜的，这也为中国的高科技产业提供了非常大的支持，尤其是太阳能电池板、电动车电子设备包括电信设施等等等等。来自亚洲时报的报道特别提供了这样的一组数据，就是中国现在已经安装的工业机器人的数量已经超过了全球其他地方的总和，占到世界总数的52%。而在北京领导层看来，正是这样自动化和规模经济的整合，让中国现在可以比世界上任何地方的竞争对手都能够成本更加低廉的生产这一些太阳能电池板、电动汽车以及其他的关键产品。而更重要的是， 现在中国的领导层似乎有这样的一种自信，就是中国的工业化，包括5G 呀、5.5G 呀、未来的6G 啊，以及人工智能在应用领域啊，这对于中国还仅仅只是一个开始。未来中国可能会突破更多前沿性的技术，甚至核聚变发明等等等等。那么我们看到，科学预算这一次增加，似乎更体现了领导层要在尖端科技以及突破方面走在世界前列的这样的雄心。来自亚洲时报的报道啊，特别引述2项重大举措。首先是开发热核聚变，这可能成为未来世界的主要能量来源，以及中国现在要建设世界上最大的粒子对撞机，可能要吸引成千上万的国际顶级科学家到中国来落足。中国现在呀，特别重视的就是这一种科学和工业能力相整合的这样的一个方向的发展。来自亚洲时代的报道，昨天呢特别注意到，在去年底的时候，有一个由中国核能公司领导的财团成立。那么财团正是希望能够在科学能力以及工业能力方面有所整合，希望能够在2030年前建造可以生产能量反应堆的这样的核聚变技术研究。这个财团到底有哪一些组成部分呢？根据来自亚洲时报的报道，总共呢是有25家中央政府拥有的企业以及研究机构，包括一些国有的能源和钢铁公司，比如我们熟知的国家电网三峡呀，以及宝钢武钢等等等等等等。这是一个方面，就是北京领导层相信中国现在已经在工业生产能力方面走在了世界前沿，并且希望在未来通过加大科技的投入，在科技和工业能力整合方面再有所进益，甚至是形成某一种世界首屈一指的垄断点。另外，我们看到，在高级粒子物理学领域，现在有关于电子对撞机的建设也是一个非常重要的这样的一个科学前沿。大家认为呢希格斯工厂所谓的这样的一个工厂往往呢需要耗时10几年甚至20几年才能够完成，而中国现在呢是已经投入了超过50亿美元的成本在这样的一个领域进行发展。看来与其关心眼前的供需问题，领导层仍然是把目光放在了所谓未来的第4次工业革命上。这是不是意味着眼前的问题就不重要呢？也不能这么讲。但是现在党的领导层，中国的这个叫中央决策层与其在说给大家发消费券，帮助整个股市回升，帮助消费者能够进一步的获得更多的财富，现在他们对于需求的提振主要集中在政治动机和政治兴趣上。那我们知道所谓的贫富差距，其实从1979年、1980年代出现大规模的城市浪潮的时候就已经有所拉大了。而所谓的共同富裕，又是习近平的关键政治议程。在这样的背景下，我们看到，对于北京、上海、广州、深圳以及这样一些1线城市的中国人而言，他们很多的生活水平和生活方式已经与工业国家或者叫做发达国家的水平比较类似了。但是中国的大部分地区的生活水平还远远落在后面。因此，现在即使是在所谓的需求侧的政策方面，北京的目标呢，更多的是集中在如何缩小城乡和区域差距这一边。即使说要进行更多的建设，进行更多的对于需求侧的扶植，往往也是集中于2、3线城市，比如低保比如医疗等等等等。而未来一段时间更强调的基础设施投入，可能更集中在扩大高铁网络，以及2、3线城市的比如廉租房改造、城中村改造这样的基础设施，来在提振需求的同时，也能够把资源和机会在地区之间进行一次重新的分配，那么获得更多的政治上的利益。 那我们知道，之前呢，我们看到了一些解决方案，比如说像卫星城新城区整个大型城市的我们叫做扩中心化等等等等。但是从2023年一直到2003年这20年间，我们看到仍然是有很多地方的大都市继续面临着人口拥挤以及资源供不应求的状况。根据中国官方的统计数据，现在拥有200万人口的我们叫做中大型城市是从30几个增加到了72个。那么一方面呢是体现了中型城市的增加，另外一方面我们也看到整个城市化的进程仍然需要中央政府的发力，而现在这可能成为未来一段时间的重要资源。至于说房地产公司，那么在西方看来房地产往往是金融危机出现问题的重要前兆。美国历史上重要的几次金融危机，往往都有我们叫做房地产引动了银行系统，银行系统再传导向实体经济，实体经济再影响到就业以及更广泛的民生问题。但是在中央政府的一些顾问来看呢，这一次国家恐怕是不会投入多少资源来救助房地产这样一些公司的。为什么呢？是因为北京领导曾认为这一些公司在城市化浪潮中已经吃尽了红利。比如我们看到深圳市中心的一套房屋的价格，可能比旁边的四川成都的完全相同的房屋价格要高出10倍。换句话说，这一次即使是在需求侧有所提振，往往可能会集中在对于执政党政治利益有直接关联的领域，比如贫富差距以及2、3线城市的基本民生问题。而至于大城市，至于这一些巨头性的房地产公司，可能会成为人为刀俎，我为鱼肉，菜板上的鱼肉，为这一次中国经济下行买单。来自亚洲时报的文章特别介绍到了现在中央领导层对于未来经济的部署布局，以及对于面向未来工业化和科学整合的思路。这在很多西方经济学者看来恐怕是并不入流的一套方案。特别是他们非常担心的是，眼下的不管是1线城市还是2线城市也好，商业活力还远远没有恢复，而西方投资者对于中国也远远不像之前的10年、20年这样感冒了。不管是心智发展力，还是面向未来的科学创造，在短期内很少可能可以改变这一种信息局态，以及对于中国就业更广泛需求面的担忧和阴云。而如果产业政策或者所谓发展精致生产力的计划没有能够成功的话，竹篮打水一场空，可能对于未来的经济生产力的提振也没有什么效益。更不要说基础设施建设，其中的腐败以及冗余问题，正是造成过去几十年中国生产扭曲畸形的重要原因和基础。那么对于中国未来到底应该怎样走，中国是否能够走出这一轮经济危机，我们刚才呢是介绍了2种完全不同的思路。到底您更认同哪一种思路？也欢迎您在节目下方告诉我们。在今天的思想先驱报中我们还有一个话题，就是为大家介绍所谓的国家资本主义，或者叫做产业政策。一提到产业政策大家可能想到的是中国制造2025新质生产力等等等等，往往认为像一个自由市场中完全注入政府的权利，可能会造成冗余、腐败以及资源的浪费。而美国呢，大家更认为是一个完全基于自由市场和企业家精神的体系。但是在最近一期彭博社的 Outlots 这样的一期播客节目中就采访到了一位历史经济学家，他就研究了美国一位国父汉密尔顿的理论。在他的研究看来，其实政府的角色从开国之初就被大幅的低估了。实际上，在各个阶段，从汉密尔顿时代到现在，政府在美国的经济发展中都扮演了一个不但关键，而且十分积极的角色。 说到汉密尔顿，大家可能首先想到的是近期爆红的音乐剧《汉密尔顿》，但是汉密尔顿其实还有一份重要的文件资料，叫做制造业报告。其中他特别分析了美国在建国之初经济面临的问题，看到了美国政府可以通过提供资金、制定政策、建立关税壁垒这样的方式，对于早期的经济发展进行推动。在汉密尔顿看来，这一种干预主义的做法并非是对资本主义的背离，反而是美国资本主义可以取得成功不可或缺的一部分。而后在作者的研究中，他也发现，不管是美国、德国，还是后来的日本，整个国家政府在工业化的过程中，其实都发挥了决定性的作用。换句话说，汉密尔顿的这一份制造业报告可以说是对自由市场理论的一个重要的修正，特别是对于亚当·施密在《国富论》中的一些观点，汉密尔顿就直言不讳对于亚当·斯密的观点提出了批评。他认为，如果要实现经济的现代化特别是实现关键的工业化，光有市场机制是不够的。那么他提出的措施就包括保护性的关税财政补助政府来投资基础设施、教育研发等等等等。在那个时候的背景下主要提出这一些想法的原因是，美国本身的工业还非常的稚嫩，而当时与美国形成竞争的欧洲的一些国家，往往已经有成熟的工业体系。同时，他认为美国经济的多元化以及工业化早期的发展，对于美国乃至全球的未来都可能产生非常重要的后果。而后，汉密尔顿的思想也的确是影响到了日本以及德国一系列的这样的一个政策制定者。不过说到汉密尔顿思想的来源，我们就必须要提到英国早期的重商主义。那么作者研究发现，英国早期的重商主义政策其实正是汉密尔顿提及有关工业政策的重要来源和基础。所谓的重商主义对于殖民地早期的经济发展实施了重大的限制，而这在汉密尔顿看来就成为了美国追求独立和经济自主的重要的这样的一个前置性的因素。那么英国政府为什么要限制包括美国在内的殖民地的制造业的发展呢？就是希望保证自己的商品能够在殖民地的市场上有比较大的占有率。而这样的做法当时是极大的禁锢到了美国这个英属殖民地的这样的一个经济增长的动因。而现在我们在谈到后来的美国革命的时候往往会看到政治理念的争论。大家还记得不能代表就不能收税这样的一个口号，我们在高中学历史都曾经学到过。但是在作者的研究就发现经济因素同样对于美国革命的动因起到了关键性的作用。当时美国的制造业者主要集中在北方，还有南方的这一些农业生产主，往往都看到了，如果美国能够从英国独立出来，可能会取得更大的经济利益。北方呢是希望摆脱英国对于美国的工业限制，发展本土的制造业；南方则是担忧英国之前对于整个殖民地的政策会限制甚至是废除奴役制，因此威胁到他们的经济利益。在这样的一个情况下，我们也必须看到，当时美国南北方的经济结构是存在着非常明显的差异的。南方呢是主要依赖于农业以及奴役劳动，主要是生产棉花和烟草等等等等。当时的北方后来是发展了更多的家庭农场和手工业制造。那么我们也知道，这成为了南北方分裂和内战的一个重要的背景。但是在革命时期不管是在革命战争时间还是在革命战争之后，汉密尔顿观察到美国政府有一个重大的问题，就是联邦政府的权力过小，没有办法有效的调配资源，甚至没有办法统一指挥军队。这就凸显了有一个强有力的中央政府在保护国家安全和经济发展中的必要性。因此当时汉密尔顿也认识到如果美国需要维持独立，如果美国防止再次沦为殖民地或者被外国势力重新征服，就必须要快速转型成独立自主的以制造业为基础的经济体系。提到独立自主这个词我们可能也想到了现在中国方面所提出的一些口号。而在汉密尔顿看来，政 政府必须要进行规划和引导，才能够实现这一些方面。当时汉密尔顿呢是美国的财政部长，那作为财政部长呢，他是提出了一系列财政和经济政策，包括建立国家银行把这个债务联邦化、提高关税等等等等。后来可以说为整个美国现代经济的基础设施奠定了基础。但是后来汉密尔顿的这样的一个以国家化推动制造业的发展的理念，也是遭遇了很多政治和意识形态上的挑战。但是后来的事实似乎证明，汉密尔顿的所谓的国家支持论中，至少有相当一部分是值得借鉴，甚至是被沿用至今的。说到沿用至今，我们就要提到美国的邮政条款。美国的邮政条款赋予了联邦政府在基础设施建设方面的权利，特别是在运输网络建设上，不仅仅是对于邮政服务的发展，也为整个美国经济的一体化、降低运输成本提供了支持。美国有很多著名的道路和运河项目都是在邮政条款下所建立的。而同时在邮政条款的敦促下，政府也是降低了美国国内市场的内部的壁垒，促进了整个国内市场的形成和整体的发展。那么这一位作者不仅仅是对于美国这个汉密尔顿这样一位国父进行了重新的研究，对于他的思想理论进行了相应的整理，同时他也梳理了早期国家支持的产业政策对于美国经济发展的影响，甚至对于整个世界经济哲学的影响。我们一直认为美国是在自由资本主义市场之上发展起来的，但是读过这一本书之后，可能你对这样的看法也会有所修正。今天我们特别推荐给大家的就是这样一部有关于汉密尔顿美国产业制造政策之父的观点的这样的评价。那么在随后您将看到的来自彭博社 Outlets 这一段播客节目中，我们可以看到主持人对于这一位作者的采访，他也对于这一本书中的细节进行了更多的介绍，希望对您有所帮助。好了，以上就是本期思想先驱报的全部内容，下期我们再会。
Did you ever see the musical Hamilton?
No, I didn't. Can I just say, listeners, Joe has already asked me this question in preparation for the podcast.
So I knew the answer.
And he actually did a really amazing summary of all of Hamilton. You didn't sing it or rap it, which I think you should have done, but it was pretty good.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think, can I just say, I actually did like it at the time that I saw it. And I still, if I'm in the car with my kids, it's not bad to put on. I feel like liking Hamilton, it's a little cringe now. It's very, so, very
It's
Obama
too mainstream for you?
It's like a little 2010s. It's a little bit we sort of moved on. But, it is an entertaining show. It's not the worst. As far as musicals go, many of which are very bad, in my opinion, it's not the worst one.
It definitely kind of vaulted Hamilton. It feels weird to say this now, but I guess it vaulted him into the public consciousness. But it's interesting because as far as I understand, and here I have to confess that I never really did U.S. history. When I was in high school, I was in Austria and then Japan. So this is a big blind spot for me. But when I think of Hamilton now, I think of the Federalist Papers, maybe the financial system.
Yeah.
But it turns out there's this huge body of Hamiltonian thought that is all about the real economy and I guess manufacturing, industrial policy development.
Yeah, and this is not at all I haven't read the Ron Chernow biography, but it's certainly not in the musical. And basically the play or the musical, he has these rap battles with Thomas Jefferson. And
Joe, summarize the rap battles.
And, obviously, Thomas Jefferson is a defender of the system of slavery. And what's important is doing the planting. And all you guys do up north is finance. But we're supposed to be on the side of finance as the audience and this and set it, first Secretary of the Treasury. But as you point out, there is much more to Hamilton than just this sort of dichotomy of the slave owning plantation owners in the South and then those of us up in New York City who just do numbers and finance.
Yeah. And I guess the other thing to point out is obviously industrial policy is having a moment since the pandemic. And we've seen various steps and projects from the Biden administration, including the IRA and things like that. So it's kind of interesting to go back in time and consider the American historical Hamiltonian roots of progressive industrial policy.
Well, and this comes out every time we do an episode, like on the CHIPS Act or the Inflation Reduction Act, et cetera. Someone says, well, you know, industrial policy is not this new thing in America. And they say, we did this in the past. And they sort of leave it there. But I think it's a good idea to like actually start exploring some of those historical roots of the role that the federal government can and has played in the past in channeling industries, channeling capital, channeling real physical resources, promoting domestic manufacturing. Because everyone says, oh, we always did this in the past, but we sort of have to talk more about what that past looked like.
Yes. So this is the episode for anyone who has ever said that statement. The U.S. has a long history of industrial policy.
We're going to go back to the very beginning. Well, I'm really excited about our guest. Like I said, I never read the Ron Chernow biography, but I did read Radical Hamilton, Economic Lessons from a Misunderstood Founder. The author, Christian Parenti, is joining us. He is a professor in the John Jay Economics program that's housed within the CUNY system of New York City. So Christian Parenti, thank you so much for coming on Odd Lots.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
I loved your book, but did you watch the musical?
I did not watch the musical. I don't really like musicals, so I didn't see
I have a complicated view towards musicals myself, so I totally get that. Why did you think another Hamilton book was necessary?
Well, I did read the Chernow biography, and while reading it, there's a mention of the report on the subject of manufacturers, which is Hamilton's magnum opus in many ways, and it is an argument for and a blueprint for planning to drive a transition from an agrarian-based economy to a manufacturing-based economy. And that was very interesting to me, and I tried to find more on it, and there really wasn't that much in the literature. So this book actually began by mistake almost. The idea was to republish the report on the subjects of manufacturers, and I would do an introduction, and then the introduction turned into a book. Along the way, I was like, oh, we'll have it as an appendix, but it just, it became an effort to fill in the gap around Hamilton's thinking about the real economy and about what we would call industrialization or industrial policy, but what they called manufacturers.
Why do you think that Hamilton's legacy is so much more focused, I suppose, on the Federalist Papers, on maybe building the financial system versus the paper that you just mentioned? Because again, I will confess that before I read the book, I had never heard of that particular piece of Hamilton writing.
Part of it has to do with the fact that the report on manufacturers was controversial from the beginning. And there was pushback from the beginning, and there has been pushback against the kinds of policies that it advocated all the way through. So it just sort of dropped away. And there is a mythology about American capitalism which tries to minimize the role of government in that story. And so that's why we had previously hadn't thought sufficiently about the report on the subject of manufacturers, because it clashes with prevailing notions about how capitalism works, which is that it's all about free enterprise and entrepreneurs and free trade. And in fact, what the story of Hamilton's report on the subject of manufacturers shows, and I think you can see it throughout world history, is that successful capitalist industrialization pretty much always involves an activist state that intervenes, gets prices wrong, and helps drive an economy towards manufacturing. In fact, in the beginning of the report on the subject of manufacturers, Hamilton launches a critique of Adam Smith. Hamilton supposedly wrote a whole treatment of Smith's Wealth of Nations, but that's been lost to us. But that's why. And I studied with Alice Amsden, who's passed away, who is an economist at the New School many, many years ago, and she wrote the definitive book, or sort of the first big book, on Korean industrialization. And it was all about this. And so that really interested me. And the similarity, the fact that the U.S. at the beginning of the story of American capitalism is the story of a developmentalist state. And I've been interested in those questions as they appear in the Global South
It's funny you mentioned Korea's development because we did an episode, Joe, I don't know if you remember, many, many years ago about the development of the K-pop and entertainment industry in South Korea and how much of it was actually driven by a conscious government effort where a lot of people think even this kind of creative industry develops naturally. But in the case of South Korea, there was a lot of support.
I actually have Alice Amsden's book, Escape from Empire, The Developing World's Journey Through Heaven and Hell, on my bookshelf. I need to read that book. Yeah. What were the economic conditions in the U.S. at the time, or I guess was it the U.S., in the colonies at the time that Hamilton was looking at? That he said, okay, we need to talk about a government role in manufacturing.
Yeah. To some extent, this gets into why the revolution occurred. And British mercantilism was putting very explicit and onerous restrictions on economic development in the United States. For example, hat makers in the U.S. couldn't have more than 2 apprentices, right? There was a robust fur trade, and beaver pelts were much in demand in Europe for making hats. And the U.S. had a nascent hat industry, and British economic policies made it illegal for it to develop, as much as it could. Similarly around, iron smelting, iron could only be processed to a certain level. So there were very real restrictions on the development of manufacturers because Britain held these 13 colonies as colonies. And so they wanted these colonies as a market. So that's one of the reasons, actually, that northern kind of nascent manufacturing interests gravitate towards revolutionary cause. There's all sorts of interests, right? I mean, there's like the rhetoric of freedom is appealing to the working classes. In the slave South, there was fear that the British Empire was going to restrict slavery because there was the Somerset case in 1773, I think it is, in which a British planter in Jamaica comes back to England with an enslaved person, and that person gets in touch with abolitionists who say, slavery is illegal in England, even though it's legal in the colonies. This goes all the way through the English court system, and it is ruled that, yes, you may be enslaved in Jamaica, but as soon as you set foot in England, you are free. This sent shockwaves of fear throughout the elites of the South. One of the richest people in the British Empire was a South Carolina slave owner, Henry Lawrence, who later is actually president of the Continental Congress. And he felt threatened, like, well, now I can't travel to England with my chattel slavery, my servants. What's next? Maybe they're going to come after slavery entirely, because there was a movement also in the northern colonies against slavery. So there's a whole variety of causes that coalesce and drive many of the colonists, though not all, to embrace revolution and independence. The economic conditions, getting back to your question, were pretty underdeveloped. Agriculture was predominant. In the South, the economy was dominated by large planters. Most white Southerners didn't own slaves, but almost half did own slaves, but most slaves were owned by a small group of men who owned many, many slaves and much land. So that was the Southern economy. And in the North, you had small family farms, and there'd almost been a kind of re-peasantization in that many of these farms were quite self-sufficient and had only a tenuous connection to the cash economy. The Revolutionary War, will actually drive many of those northern tier farmers into the cash economy because they have to pay taxes and they have to come up with cash. So, and in those northern family farms, there were small craft productions. There was home-based productions, generally, like building along with your self-sufficient farm. You maybe produce a little extra dairy for the market, but then also in the winter you create barrel staves or shoes or something like that. So there was this workshop-based manufacturing. There are no American banks. And the 13 colonies are all independent. There's no transportation network. So after the war, it's an absolute mess. And Hamilton's concern is first and foremost national security. He says, we're going to be reconquered and recolonized if we don't have a strong army and navy and state. And the only way we can afford that is if we transition as quickly as possible to a manufacturing-based economy. And that's not going to happen by following Adam Smith and letting the market do its thing. We need to actually have a plan that can help push this transition. At first, Hamilton is not particularly concerned with economics. He's writing about democracy and all that. When fighting begins, he organizes an artillery company and he serves for about a year on the front lines. And because he's so brilliant and good at what he does, he's receiving these offers from generals to join their staffs, and he holds out until Washington offers him a place on his quote-unquote family, which is to say his staff. So then Hamilton transitions to the role of a kind of military planner, and he has an overall view of the war. And what he sees is, one, total dysfunction at the level of politics because the colonies are not properly united. They're operating under the Articles of Confederation,
right,
which is just a loose security pact, and each colony is essentially a sovereign state. And so there's a continental army which answers to Congress, but there are also these militias, state militias. And so states would send aid to the continental army and put provisions on them, say, like, this clothing is for the Pennsylvania line, please don't distribute this weaponry to whatever, the New England line, this kind of stuff. Congress had no means of taxing. So Hamilton is viewing all of this from this kind of Archimedean bird's eye view on Washington's staff.
So one of the things that comes through in your book, and again, I don't know much about this, but I didn't realize how much of a basket case the Revolutionary War kind of was, and how disorganized in some respects and just terrible physical conditions. So you write about how, there were soldiers who rebelled because they weren't getting paid because there were no taxes. So the federal government, which didn't really exist, could not pay them. And also how soldiers had to be let loose in the forest to slaughter wild pigs because they didn't have enough food supply. And things like that. It very much seems to highlight the idea or the importance of the role of the supply chain and physical, real goods in military conflict, and I guess by extension in government.
Absolutely. And I think many of us labor under misapprehension that the Revolutionary War was a guerrilla war and that the patriots were living off the land and, taking pot shots at the British from behind stone walls.
That's how we learned it when I was in elementary school.
Yeah, that's how I learned it. But actually, it was a conventional war, which is to say very expensive. And most of the conflicts were force on force with these long supply chains. Everything had to be provided to these armies. Salt, for example, something as mundane as salt. This was extremely important. As one old article put it, said salt was as important to the Revolutionary War armies as gasoline was to the armies of 1945. If you didn't have salt for the animals, they would very quickly get weak and couldn't function. You had to cure food with salt. So salt was essential. There really wasn't a salt industry in the colonies because one of the few things that the British Navigation Acts, one of the weird little kind of wrinkles in them, was that they allowed ships coming from Europe to fill their hulls for ballast with French salt. So there was this flow of relatively cheap, high-quality salt into the colonies, so the colonies didn't actually have much of a salt industry. So during the war, that's cut off, so they have to start developing a salt industry. They've got these, anemic little foundries, one down in Virginia, some up in Pennsylvania. They have to start building all this up as the war is going on. And even though there were these long supply lines, things were so harsh that there was also what they called the grand forage, that soldiers would go out to requisition and nominally purchase supplies. But they're doing this with a series of increasingly worthless scripts. At first, you have the continental dollar, which the British are also counterfeiting. And then they just overproduce continental dollars so that they're worthless. Then they create this IOU system called Pierce's notes, which turn into another kind of paper currency. But these requisition squads would go out into the countryside and say to farmers, well, if you support the cause, we're here to buy with this worthless money, whatever, 10% of your produce, half your chickens, whatever. And if you refuse, then they say, well, you're a loyalist, you're against our cause, so we're just going to confiscate everything. So they're pushing all of this paper currency, which during the war leads to inflation, and then there's a big crash after the war. So it's totally chaotic. And the scale of some of these operations is nuts. There was a campaign in 1779 against the Iroquois, who had mostly sided with the British, and it involved damming a river, building a road to the river, building a fleet of boats to go down the river, and then blowing this dam and riding this wave of water down river to then launch on this expedition against the Iroquois. So capital intensive, labor intensive, big economic endeavor.
So one of the things that's interesting these days is, people have talked for years in the U.S. like, oh, we need to revive domestic manufacturing. And it's just one of those things that gets said. What seems to help get the votes over the line to actually do endeavors, even when it comes to something like climate, is the idea of existential national security threat. We have to compete against China, right? Like that's how it's framed. And when there's the rivalry with China as the framing, then that opens the door for votes. And it sounds like, and you talk about this in your book, that ultimately it was the same, that at the end, it's like there is no sovereign U.S. without manufacturing.
Yes.
That we can't maintain our independence, even if we win it, without manufacturing.
That was Hamilton's insight, that this independence would be totally illusory if it was not backed up with material force, and that material force was going to be expensive, and that required an economic transformation, an industrialization program. But they didn't use that word. They talked about manufacturers. So that's what he sets out to do. And amidst the war, he has a kind of what seems to be a mental breakdown. He goes into this nervous fever during the winter when they're all at Valley Forge, and there's a number of generals going rogue, and he's sent up to reimpose order. And then he has this crazy breakdown. And after that, his writing is really different. He begins a series of letters to elites outlining the need for constitutional convention and an economic plan. And so the rest of his life is that. And it should be said that the war ends in 1783. There are rebellions like increasing in the ranks, mutinies, culminating with a mutiny by officers in Newburgh, New York, which is often misrepresented as if these guys are all greedy and trying to, have some coup d'etat. But they are suffering like their men. I mean, they have boots. Some of their men are shoeless, but it's like they had really suffered, and they were demanding from Congress some resources. After the war, beginning in, the fighting kind of winds down around 1780, but the Treaty of Paris isn't until 1783. And there then begins what's called the critical period, which is a period in which the United States is still governed by the Articles of Confederation. And all sorts of serious economic and political and even military problems begin to happen. There's a trade war between New Jersey and New York and Connecticut. Maryland and Virginia are having similar trade wars on the Chesapeake. There's conflict with maroon communities, self-emancipated, formerly enslaved people, some of whom had served with the British Army, who have these autonomous communities on the border of South Carolina and Georgia. There's increasing conflict with Native Americans in what's now Kentucky. There's conflict between groups of white settlers and their speculative land backers, like these two competing factions in the Wyoming Valley of Pennsylvania, which it turns into a shooting war in which people are being killed and homes are burned. And then all of this culminates with Shays' Rebellion in 1786 in western Massachusetts. And all of these states had gone heavily into debt during the war. And many of those IOUs that I mentioned earlier were bought up at pennies, on the dollar vis-a-vis their face value by speculators. And in Massachusetts, 35 people owned almost half of all of the state's debt. And Congress is making these requests. And in 1784, there's this massive requisition request, which by 1786 is really hurting people on the ground. And so this request for a tax take from Congress is part of what's pushing Massachusetts to shake down its farmers. There's also, interestingly, a series of volcanic eruptions, one in Iceland and one in Japan.
Oh, yeah, which affected the growing season, right?
Yeah. There's a really, really cold summers and floods knocking out crops and barns. So all this is happening. And
we were barely hanging on in those days.
Yeah. And so amidst this, there's this massive wave of foreclosures in Massachusetts and also in New Hampshire and other parts of New England. But in Massachusetts, this coalesces into an actual armed rebellion led by veterans of the Revolutionary War, in particular, Daniel Shays. The Shaysites didn't call themselves Shaysites. They called themselves regulators. And what they did was they just closed down the courts. And the militia was called up to put an end to this, and the militia would switch sides or refuse to fight or just melt away. So the coastal elites who owned all the debt that they were trying to collect on by foreclosing on these farms create a private army. They take up a subscription of a private army, and there's actually a series of force-on-force battles with cannons, and the Shaysites are defeated in the early spring, winter of 1787. And it's in response to that crisis that the Constitutional Convention happens in Philadelphia. There's literally like
this is Hamilton. This is what Joe said Hamilton the musical was.
Right.
Okay. So can I just ask you can kind of see why Hamilton would make the argument that the U.S., such as it was at that time, needs to develop industrially, build out manufacturing capacity, create a strong system of government and things like that. But one thing I don't quite understand from that period is why was agrarianism seemingly so well regarded? Because it's hard for me to even envision a time when there was this agrarian ideal because we're so used to talking about development, linear development of economies. You know, you move from farming to manufacturing to a service-based economy. It's weird to think that at that time there was actually a number of people who said that agrarianism was the best economic system.
Yes, most famous among them, Thomas Jefferson. Agrarianism was popular because that's what most people did. And Jefferson famously or infamously says in one correspondence that it would be better to leave manufacturing workshops in Europe because manufacturing brings with it a degradation of character and that the farming classes are the most noble. And so it was a very romantic argument about national character. Underneath that, though, was also a very material concern with what it would mean for the slave South were the North, where there was, at this point, you know, at the end of the Revolution, slavery has been outlawed in Massachusetts. It's been outlawed in Vermont, which is not yet actually a state. It's on the way to being outlawed in Pennsylvania and New York. That'll take a couple more decades. But the Southern elite can see the writing on the wall that their system is unpopular. And if the North becomes more populous and wealthier, then it would dominate the federal government. This was their fear, and then perhaps come after their property. And that is indeed what happened. And part of what drove that Northern hostility to slavery was humanitarian. It was like a sort of religious kind of humanitarian sensibility, but there was also an element of self-interest. Northern farmers were really worried that this system would crowd them out of Western lands and that it might extend to the North. They did not think, slavery is naturally limited to agrarian work on cotton and tobacco in the South. They were worried that the workers of the North could also be enslaved. That's just sort of just emerging at the time of the Revolution. So anyway, so that's part of what is motivating Jefferson's hostility initially to manufacturing and this romanticization of the agrarian character. It's also that they don't want the northern states to get too powerful. And so the Constitution actually involves all sorts of compromises to compensate for the fact that that's very likely to happen. The Senate being one of those important compromises where every state gets 2 senators. And the Southern elites dominated the Senate for a very long time. And it should be said, up until the Civil War, the richest people in the country were always Southern elites, even though the South was generally impoverished. And even to this day, the southeast of the U.S. bears the marks of underdevelopment in terms of numerous indicators of well-being, rates of interpersonal violence, early death, all this kind of stuff.
What did industrial policy, of which, again, I know they didn't call it that at the time, but like to Hamilton, what did it look like specifically? What should the federal government be empowered to do? How should it make those decisions? Like, okay, it's all philosophically, He criticized Adam Smith. He saw reasons on the ground why there needed to be a strong state to develop that. What does that look like in practice in terms of actual policy choices made by the government to foster these industries?
Well, all of that is laid out in the report on the subject of manufacturers. And he calls the things that the federal government should do the means proper. It should also be said that the report on manufacturers is the first time the word capitalist is used in the English language.
I was amazed to read that. So you said the first published mention of the word capitalist.
As far as I can tell, yeah.
Wow.
Yep. It had been used in French earlier, but that was the first time it's in English. So the means proper for Hamilton involve tariffs, prohibitive taxes on imports so as to defend infant industries, as they would later be called. Hamilton calls them infant manufacturers, but also drawbacks from those tariffs, subsidies for specific firms that need help, bans on exports of strategic raw materials, investment in physical infrastructure, investment in planning and in R&D, research and development, and general education. And ultimately, he wanted to have a planning board, something like the Japanese Ministry of Industry and Technology. That never came to fruition, but he lays out in tremendous detail, basically the means proper, this toolbox for economic planning. And the standard story is that it was shot down. He even opens the door to the idea of public ownership. He also, more well known, of course, and before pitching the manufacturing plan, he creates the credit system, right? He creates the First Bank of the United States. And the standard story is that, well, it came to nothing, but actually a bunch of it was passed. And over time, more and more of what Hamilton outlined in the Report on Manufacturers is implemented. And it's often implemented in moments of crises, because frequently what happens is the free marketeers win the argument. There isn't sufficient taxation, there isn't sufficient regulation, and then there's an economic crash and a crisis in which planning is sort of spontaneously summoned in to clean up the mess. So in the long run, the report on the subject of manufacturers really does triumph and does guide American industrialization, and was also very influential on other industrialization processes.
Can you talk about the relationship between Hamilton's vision of industrial policy, and again, he doesn't use that term, but the means proper, and I guess how it's financed? Because he seems to make, and obviously this is where I think a lot of what we're seeing from the Biden administration now tends to get a little bit controversial, because people say like, oh, well, we're building all this stuff, but also the public debt has absolutely exploded. What did Hamilton say about that aspect of it? And one thing that I was kind of thinking is he seems to talk a lot about external financing. So building up state credibility in order to convince creditors to give you money so that you can fund all these projects. And when I think about that, in addition to some of the like tariffs and bounties and subsidies that he was talking about, I don't want to say beggar thy neighbor policies, but like you start to think about, well, why would these other countries fund American development? And also, can everyone pursue these type of policies all at once? Can everyone draw on external debt in order to develop their own economies?
Well, taking the first part first. So what Hamilton does is all the states have debt. And so when he is Treasury Secretary, he's the first Treasury Secretary under Washington, he pursues assumption of the state debts, as it's called, so that the federal government will buy up at face value all these state debts, which will help reinflate the state economies and liberate the state governments from this debt. But in exchange, the states have to hand over their Western land claims. And many states like didn't have a Western boundary. It was just like, and the Western boundary of Virginia is
it's somewhere in that direction.
Yeah, we haven't been to the Pacific yet, but it's like out there as far as we can go.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, and so getting all of that land and federalizing it is also a very important part of the toolbox for American industrialization. So the way Hamilton pays for the debt is by taking a loan in Europe. And he offers 4% interest when most European debt is offering 3% interest. And there's a debate at the time about whether or not the debt should just be, paid off. And Hamilton says, no, we need to, this is
roll it over, essentially. You want to keep borrowing.
Yeah, what he calls a funded debt. So So this is what happens. And part of this is also about keeping your enemies close. He doesn't want the speculator class to turn on the state and attack it and undermine it. He wants to deal them in. And critics say, oh, see, he was just a servant of these elites. And it's like, well, yeah, he was helping their interests. But he also was concerned very pragmatically about having this class of speculators turn against the state. And so he wanted them to be committed to state stability. Because I should say, he's very explicit about the risk of the country fragmenting and falling apart and disintegrating into civil war, which, it does to some extent due to the power of states. So Hamilton was very opposed to state power. Anyway, so that's part of how he funds it. And then also, prior to the Washington administration, states had their own rules, and generally the tariff was around 8%. After Hamilton's plans go through, it's about 13%. The interesting thing is that the overall tax burden actually goes down.
Yeah, I made a note of this because I thought it was really interesting. And again, I think when people think about like public infrastructure building and industrial policy nowadays, they think like, oh, my taxes will go up. But in this particular instance, I think they fell 77% from 1785 to 1788.
Yeah, and that's partly because there wasn't this insane effort to just pay off all the debts, and also because there are productive investments being made. Another crucial piece of this toolbox is actually the post office.
Yeah, that was really interesting to me. Say more about that.
So in the postal clause, my favorite clause in the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution is very often overlooked, and that explains what the government can do. Most constitutional scholarship focuses on how the government works, the divided government, different branches. But what does this government allow itself to do is rarely explored. And so Article 1, Section 8 is where that is laid out. That's what Congress can do. And there's a debate around the postal clause. Benjamin Franklin and Hamilton and other Federalists, as they were called, they wanted to empower the federal government to build canals because they needed transportation infrastructure. And that is opposed by primarily Southerners. As is later said, some decades afterwards, when the question of canals, federally funded canals, again comes up, Daniel Macon, a congressman from Georgia, answers a young local politician who asks him, he says, how come we're opposed to federal funding of canals? And Macon says, if we allow Congress to fund canals, they will no sooner and with more propriety soon be after our slaves. He doesn't say slaves, he's, some euphemism. So there was, again, this concern. If, the more you empower the federal government, the greater the risk to slavery. So there is no mention of canals. However, the postal clause says that the post office has the right to build post roads. And that little thing, roads, well, by the 1820s, most rivers were declared post roads.
Oh, brilliant.
And the post office becomes a massive public works agency. We think of rivers as passive natural features, but they required enormous amounts of transformation to be economically useful. And it was the post office that did that, hiring contractors. For example, on the Red River, which runs up through Arkansas, this is after Hamilton's time, but these are the effects of Hamilton's work playing out. There was a 100-mile-long snake-infested logjam called the Raft, and it blocked settlement of Arkansas and Missouri. And it was the federal government, i.e. the post office, that went in and cleared that. And so the post office built the vast majority of roads, and that lowered transportation costs, that knit together a national economy. It also subsidized business communications and the press and did enormous amount to create a national market.
That's incredibly interesting. And up until you talked about it in the book, I had not realized the developmental role for the post office. But I'm glad you said that thing about the young congressman. Why do we oppose allowing the federal government to have this role in the building of canals? And, there was concerns that the abolition movement was going to rise and their way of life and their economic system was going to get destroyed by the advent of slavery. There still is a lot of opposition to the idea that the federal government can have a productive role to play in building out infrastructure or doing whatever the equivalent is of building out a canal today. So are there deeper strains or other sort of related ideas that you can draw between, the late 1700s and today, excluding slavery, why there's still economic interest of deep anxiety about the role of the federal government in these things?
Yeah, I think persistent throughout American history is the fear of the slippery slope by the incumbent economic elites. And if the federal government is proposing transformations of any sort, there are always going to be some interests that are threatened by that. And the other thing is it's expensive. And so no one really wants to pay taxes. And so industries and lobbies are constantly pushing to lower taxes. And so part of the argument for that is don't spend the money. Don't do these big projects. Just give us the money. Let us keep the money. These big projects are pointless, and we handle the money better.
In the few minutes remaining, can you please defend industrial policy from every single criticism that has ever been made against it? No, but I am thinking back to Adam Smith. And, Adam Smith's argument was partly one of security, the idea that trade would build relationships between countries, whereas Hamilton's argument, it seems, is centered on the development of the U.S., the building of a strong state, and how those two are related to each other. So I guess, number one, what does Hamiltonian-style industrial policy actually mean for trade relationships between countries and the prospects for peace? But then also, can you talk a little bit about arguments about, well, government spending creates unproductive capacity, or it's unfair for governments to pick winners or losers? Again, I'm asking you to basically address all the critiques of industrial policy in the few minutes we have allotted to us.
Well, the first thing I would say is it's not like industrial policy always works out. There are problems with it. It's not easy to do. However, if you look at the history of industrialization in one country after another, it does raise the standard of living, and it generally works. But it always involves a developmentalist, activist state. So I don't think there's any escaping that. Now, that can be done in better or worse ways. And the U.S. plays an important role in that. These ideas from Hamilton go to Frederick List, who goes to Germany, who then very influential on the Meiji Restoration in Japan and Japan's industrialization, and on to today. But so in terms of, I think that's the most important argument, is that the actual story of industrialization always involves an activist state. In terms of trade, Hamilton was not opposed to trade. He just didn't want to be subordinated to this dominant power, the British. His concern with national sovereignty and industrial development didn't come at the expense of international trade. So almost always exports also play a very important part of industrialization. Take, for example, a place like Rwanda. Rwanda is very explicit, very kind of Hamiltonian. They say, look, if we don't have economic growth and development, we're going to have another genocide. We've had, 4 or 5, whatever it is, right? And they're heavily dependent on exporting tea. They don't want to not export tea, but they've had conflicts with the IMF because they want to run a 3% budget deficit so that they can fund public education all the way, through K through 12. And they say, look, if our farmers are all illiterate, we can't increase productivity and we can't develop. So I'm speaking to industrialization rather than industrial policy.
Sure.
Like what we're dealing with here in the U.S. is something new, which is kind of like the question of reindustrialization. And, that's actually a very different problem and project.
The book is written to the left. What did you feel the need for this particular audience to read this particular history?
Well, there's a hostility, I think, to the U.S. projects on the left that is not helpful. And there's also a misunderstanding of the Constitution. People write off the Constitution as a document written by slaveholders. And I was struck in getting under the hood, about how many progressive elements there are in the American constitutional tradition. And I came away from this project with a much deeper appreciation and respect for that. And I wanted to disabuse leftists who fall into these sort of facile notions about the Constitution being bad. I disagree with that. And I think there's actually a lot of room for quote unquote progressive goals to be met through the Constitution. The general welfare clause, which Thomas Jefferson freaked out about and he didn't like. He said, this could mean almost anything. It's like, yes, it opens the door to all types of egalitarian projects potentially.
I have one more thing, which is, again, when I think about Hamilton's experience versus what's happening today, one of the things I think about is that, as you said, a lot of what he recommended didn't immediately come to fruition. People like Jefferson stood in the way. And nowadays, there seems to be, a sort of similar back and forth within D.C. But how do you build political consensus for this type of policy, because that really seems to have been the challenge for Hamilton. It happened over time to some degree, but it certainly didn't happen immediately. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know how you build political consensus around it. You don't do it by not admitting any fault and not having conversations. So I cannot tell you how political consent can be built.
But, I suppose you'll have to write a whole other book about that.
Yeah, I mean, and there are, you guys, I just listened to a podcast you did with some Irish guy about, the EU policies. Yeah. I mean, it's it's not like there aren't problems with these agendas, and those have to be acknowledged and those blockages removed.
That's what I was going to say, Tracy, when you said that, it seems so quaint that people are skeptical of the arrow of economic trajectory. I was like, we just did this episode, and I felt I had a lot of sympathy.
I know, but if you read the book, the idealization of agrarianism is just very surprising to me, especially because you think back to the late 1700s and you don't think that subsistence farming was a particularly glamorous activity. But then again, as Christian was pointing out, there's all this idealism and values attached to the hard work of being a farmer
and the wealth of the
and that too. Yeah.
And it did provide autonomy for yeoman farmers. And so there were legitimate concerns about the loss of that autonomy. One final argument for industrial planning, for government intervention, is that it is, as Karl Polanyi says, laissez-faire, free trade was planned, and planning is spontaneous, because the pattern again and again is that the forces that want free market advocate for that. They get deregulation, they get tax cuts, and that inevitably leads to a crash in which the government has to step in and regulate and nationalize. And we just lived through that with 2008, right? I mean, you had an entire generation of bankers and policy experts who had argued against government intervention. And when 2008 came, what did they do? They basically nationalized the U.S. banking system for a number of years and bailed the whole thing out. So another argument for industrial policy is that government intervention in a capitalist economy is inevitable. It's going to either happen ad hoc during an emergency, or it can happen consciously through democratic deliberation.
Tracy, I really enjoyed that conversation. Even setting aside sort of some of the economic lessons, just sort of revisiting some of the assumptions we make about the history of that time and what it was actually like, I find to be very useful.
Yeah. We didn't even really get into this, but there was also, I think, an instance of price controls immediately after the Revolutionary War. We're going to have to do a whole other hour on this with Christian at some point.
Yeah, we should. There's another interesting thing, and I meant to ask a question about it, but I'm aware that there is a thing in American history called the War of 1812, and I almost know nothing about it. I certainly was not. I think they set the White House on fire.
Yeah.
That's all I know. But in the book, there's a lot in there about the basically insufficiency of the U.S. national defense at that point, born in part due to poor domestic investment that allowed us to be in a situation where the British could, destroy Washington, D.C.
It's funny. I didn't study or hear that much about the Revolutionary War, but when I went to university in London, there sure was a lot of talk in my international history class about the War of 1812.
That's so funny. Yeah, I literally realized I know very little about it, and I don't think it gets talked about very much.
I was waiting for you to drop the idea of Hamilton being a secret MMTer.
Clearly. I mean, come on. No, but it is really interesting. And, this idea of that there were ways in the U.S. Constitution. And I thought that was a really interesting point, that embedded in the Constitution are these various clauses and comments or lines that really do open up a lot of space for active economic power from the government.
Yeah. I also thought the point about, not just dismissing the some of the negativities that can go with industrial policy is really important. Because if you're going to, you can do it. You can also do it wrong, to Christian's point. And there are plenty of examples throughout world history of things kind of going off the rails and stuff like that. But you need to have a reasonable and honest discussion about the pros and cons and the goals of the policy as well. What exactly you're trying to do here and what the results are that you want to see. It can't just be throw money at every single problem. You have to have some specificity about what you're trying to achieve.
Absolutely. And that's so fascinating because I knew that about like Friedrich List and the industrialization of Germany and the influence that his work in Germany then had on Japan. But the fact that his work actually draws to Hamilton, the fact that Hamilton was the first to write the word capitalist in the English language, pretty fascinating history.
Yeah, absolutely. Shall we leave it there?
Let's leave it there.